All right, good morning. We're so happy to have you. Welcome back for May's book review. Today, we're really excited to have a discussion about this book, Race, Rights, and the Asian American Experience. Which was really appropriate because May is Asian and Asian American Pacific Heritage Month. So in order to celebrate that month, we thought this would be a good book to discuss, which is Race, Rights, and the Asian American Experience. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and I have the absolute pleasure and honor of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I'm going to serve as a moderator and also provide some brief introductions today, some introductory thoughts to the book. And then we're going to turn it over to each of our panelists who's going to talk for about 10 minutes each. And then that should leave us with approximately 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So if you could save your questions to the end, we would appreciate it. Although certainly feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box before the end of the panel, although we will wait till the end to answer those questions. To ask questions, please use, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. So please use that function in order to ask your questions. It allows us to easier track questions as they come in. And I want to briefly introduce each of our panelists before I share my initial thoughts, although I think some of the panelists are going to talk a little bit more about their backgrounds and their experiences as a launching pad for relating to the book and some of the themes that are in the book. So I'm only going to briefly introduce them, and then I think you'll hear some more about them later on throughout the presentation. As is our tradition, we're going to go in alphabetical order. So that means that we will start with Judge Augustus Chin. Judge Chin is a judge with the Holiday Justice Court here in Utah. Then we're going to turn it over to Marlene Gonzalez, who works with Pearson Butler and focuses on immigration law. And then we're going to finish, last but not least, Oreen Shin, who works with Consumer Reports. And then after each of them talk for about 10 minutes again, that'll leave us with about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So I just want to kick it off with some of my thoughts on the book. I found the book incredibly interesting, educational. I certainly learned a lot, and also very timely. So we initially picked this topic because, as I mentioned before, May is Asian and Asian American Pacific Heritage Month, but it's particularly timely because as a result of the COVID-19 virus, we're seeing a spike in discrimination against Asian and Asian American individuals here in the United States because of stereotyping and beliefs that somehow Asians and Asian Americans were to blame for the COVID-19 virus. In fact, some people refer to it as the Wuhan virus, referencing China. And so it seems particularly timely that we're having this conversation today while this discrimination has increased. It certainly hasn't appeared. I think as we'll talk about today, many of our panelists will have numerous stories to share with you about discrimination in their own experiences, but it certainly has spiked during this time of the pandemic. So it's a very timely conversation, both because of the celebrations for May and because of what's happening in our society today. I thought it was particularly prophetic because if you look at page 40 of the book, and this book is copyrighted, let me see, let's say it's copyrighted in 2006, so it's certainly not writing about the pandemic. At page 40, the author says, "It is not a coincidence that the most virulent anti-Asian sentiment has occurred during economic recessions and depressions, when racial scapegoating typically peaks." So it's interesting that even though there are some things that are a little unique about our current situation and our current financial crisis, given that it's triggered by this health crisis, it is interesting that this book with a 2006 copyright has basically predicted and shown that this anti-American discrimination, which spikes, tends to spike in times of economic recession. So I thought that was really interesting as I was reading through the book. As I mentioned before, I really enjoyed the book because I learned a great deal. One of the things that's been consistent with my experiences, even though I am racial minority because I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, my experience is very different from other racial minorities in the United States. And I thought the book did a really good job of driving that home and talking about some of the unique contours of challenges that may affect Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. In particular, chapter 1 starts off by really explaining how this black-white paradigm that we typically talk about in terms of race relations in the United States, it does not work for the Asian and Asian American experience because it is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. And the book does a really nice job of, in chapter 2, going through the history of the Asian and Asian American experience within the United States and demonstrating how, unlike perhaps the African American or Black American experience, immigration and language are tied often to the Asian and Asian American experience in a way that might be slightly different from other immigrants, although there's a lot of overlap with Latinx communities as well. So I thought that was an interesting way to talk about it. At page 16, the book specifically talks about the fact that this dynamic doesn't work and talks about what the book will focus on in terms of looking at the Asian and Asian American experience. The author says that he will argue that anti-Asian subordination is qualitatively different from anti-Black subordination. Rather than being centered on color, which divides racially between the superior and the inferior, anti-Asian subordination is centered on citizenship, which divides racially between American and foreigner. He also goes on to argue that immigration from Asia during the past 4 decades has shifted from racial demography in the United States and has caused ethnicity and other attributes of immigrants to become powerful forces in race relations. So again, kind of tying on and building on this theme that immigration and language really play a central role in the experience of maybe many Asian and Asian Americans within the United States. He then goes on to explain why oftentimes this type of discrimination and stereotyping exists. This is really common for the human brain to engage in stereotyping. We all do it at some level. And he explains at page 46 that according to cognitive theory, categorization and stereotyping are normal processes through which people perceive the world and make sense of it. The vast amount of sensory information that individuals must process requires them to simplify complex data and to shape them into something manageable. Stereotyping around race operates much in the same way that stereotyping about any other category operates. Individuals have a set of criteria, a schema is one commonly used term, that they use to understand the world. And they make judgments based on a combination of those criteria and perceived information. Cognitive theory posits that categorizing and stereotyping are normal mental processes. So this is something that we all just naturally do, but certainly we've seen in the Asian American and Asian experience that it's had detrimental effects. So I think then the book goes on to do a really nice job of laying out the history of how Asian and Pacific and Asian American communities within the United States have really experienced perhaps this discrimination in a different way. It makes the point that race is a social construction, and as it goes through the history, it talks about how there have been instances when Asians and Asian Americans have been classified as white for certain purposes, and then in other purposes have been classified as Black. So it really does make this point that race is not constant and that has changed throughout our history of the United States as to whether Asians and Asian Americans are perceived as being white or Black. And then the book does a nice job of going through and demonstrating how this discrimination over time has been tied to immigration and to language. So prior to 1965, and 1965 is really a watershed moment because that's when we get the immigration law, which precludes discrimination on the basis of race. But prior to 1965, Asian immigrants saw discriminatory laws targeting migrants from Asia. Everything from the Nationality Act of 17 1790, which limited citizenship to white men, and of course was not changed until the Civil War. In fact, the Supreme Court didn't hold until 1898 that people who were born in the United States were citizens, even if their parents were not nationalized. And that was a lawsuit that was brought by an Asian American individual. There are also numerous instances of federal laws discriminating against Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. For example, the Page Law of 1875 resulted in all Chinese women being labeled as prostitutes so that they could not legally immigrate into the United States. Also, white women who married Asian men would lose their citizenship if they did marry Asian men. Interestingly, I think these are examples of intersectionality too, because you'll see a lot of these laws impacting Asian women in particular in a way that we didn't necessarily see men being impacted, or women being impacted in a way that we don't necessarily see men being impacted. As a result of many of these laws from the 19th century and the early 20th century, we saw a dramatic reduction in immigration from Asia into the mid 20th century. And then of course we have the sad reality of Japanese internment during World War II, which Utah, of course, has a connection to because we have 2 internment camps here in Utah. And we had the Korematsu decision out of the U.S. Supreme Court, which said that U.S. federal laws should undergo strict scrutiny, and that usually such laws would be struck down as impermissible racial discrimination. However, because of the national security interest, the United States was allowed to engage in internment. And it wasn't until very late into the 20th century that the United States apologized for the internment policy. So that policy existed without apology for decades. State laws also were very actively engaged in discrimination. For example, in California, several Chinese laundry individuals lost their permits because of state regulations, which prohibited them on the basis of race and nationality from having those laundry permits. Those of you from your common law class, you might remember that this was the Yik Wu decision, which resulted in the Supreme Court holding that the 14th Amendment protects non-citizens, and also that even if a statute is race neutral, as the California statute claimed to be, it still could have discriminatory racial impacts. So our Asian and Asian American members of our society have done a wonderful job over the centuries and the decades of really challenging a lot of these discriminatory laws. Again, 1965 is really a watershed moment because we saw passage of the Immigration Act that limited prohibitions based on race and national origin in terms of immigration, and had some impacts on Asian and Asian American immigration into the United States. And that's where I'm going to end because I think a lot of our panelists are going to take up their experiences or their families' experiences that resulted after 1965. But I'll just say again, it was really eye-opening experience. I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed this book. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judge Chin. Judge Chin. Oh, Judge Chin, you're on mute.
There you are. Thank you, Dean. I apologize. I agree with the Dean that this is a particularly interesting book, particularly on a personal level. As I read the book, it brought to mind some of the things that the author said. One of the things he said in the preface was that he makes no pretense of being neutral or objective about racism based on his experiences. And there are experiences I have had over the years, 33 years since I've been a citizen, that have also swayed me to be more conscientious about it. I think of particular import in this book is it reminds us of the history, the role of the law by virtue of the courts and legislation in terms of the perpetuation of this notion of discrimination at all levels, but also serves to help us to focus on what we can do individually. And that for me is particularly important, especially at this phase of my legal career. One of the things I thought was quite compelling was, as the Dean mentioned in chapter 2, I look at page 45 of chapter 2, and he makes the following statement: all of us carry some racial baggage based on our experiences, our social interactions, and our exposure to the value systems and ideologies of the society in which we live. How we behave racially may be conscious and explicit, but often it is unconscious and done with the best of intentions. And that gave me pause, because as I read that, I had to reread it a couple of times, because I think sometimes, even if it's unconscious, I don't see it being with the best of intentions, because racism should never be viewed in my opinion, in that kind of a light. There has to be some underlying experience or principle behind it. And for me, even in the legal world, even today, we still face that. There are those, I remember going to law school and having been accepted to the U, my alma mater, and an acquaintance was on a wait list. And he was so upset. And he's a member of the majority population. He's Caucasian. And he said, I'm on a wait list, and all these other people got in with affirmative action. And I don't think he realized who he was talking to, a person of color who happened to have gotten admitted to the U, and yet he was frustrated because affirmative action was the reason why people of color got in to law school. So there are those who consciously use it as a basis to vent, in my opinion. Then another thing that the author points out is this notion of the immigration issues, which I know Marlene will touch on a little later. But the accent discrimination is one of the things that I certainly identify with. And on page 123, he acknowledges every English speaker has an accent that may reflect regional origins, whether English is the person's primary language. And I shared with members of the panel earlier on another occasion how there are those who view accent in a different manner. I can remember being told, oh, you speak English well. Where did you learn English? Or also being suggested, the way you speak makes you sound intelligent. And I took offense to that, because one's language is not an indication of the level of intelligence, but the viewpoint must be so embedded in the individual that they fail to realize the sort of discriminatory undertones that applies. Another thing that the author identifies in chapter 2 is the origin issue, where he talks about having experienced the questions where you're from, because we appear different than the majority, or you may sound a bit different. They'll say, where are you from? Or what are you? I remember being asked, and I say, I'm American. And they say, no, really, what are you? Or where you're from. And I don't think there is that realization, again, those undertones that apply. I do think also, and by appearance, I'm not of a light complexion, but I particularly identified with that one drop rule, which the author acknowledges on page 43 and later in chapter 6 on race and identity. My wife who is Caucasian, and I happen to be in Texas for a government management program. And I remember distinctly people asking her if I'm Black. And that's how I realized that's where that one drop rule comes in. Because you look of a darker complexion, they're wondering if you're Black and how it applies. And I think there's a conscious objective behind that, because of the curiosity that individuals have as to why is that person speaking that way with an Asian name, but yet so dark toned in complexion. And so I think sometimes we have to be cautious how we express, how we communicate as well. And I try to point out to everyone when they try to tell me that I have an accent, I said, everyone has an accent. We all have an accent. What I found quite also compelling was when you look at some of the experiences that he identifies during 2002, on page 9, people being told to go back to their country, where all Asians are viewed in one context, whether they're Korean descent, Chinese descent, Japanese descent, During the internment or in the Karumatsu era, even the Chinese had to say, I'm Chinese. As you read that history, you get a sense as to how people of color, Asians and others, have to try to distinguish themselves so they're not incorrectly identified. And that's unfortunate because for me, in my opinion, where we are all Americans of different ancestry, that should be the predominant issue. The author, Professor Ancheta, also recognizes, and I thought this was particularly compelling, where he says, there is no uniform Asian American experience that defines the realities of all Asian Americans, nor is there a single definition that fully captures who Asian Americans are or how they're perceived by others. Even as I've been on the bench for several years, it's amazing how some people will question my nationality sometimes or the origin, not realizing, and it shows some ignorance on their part, that may be true, but nonetheless, we have a far way to go. And my personal experiences and my family's experiences would suggest that when you look at the Cable Act, my wife would lose her citizenship if the Cable Act was still in force today. And her experiences with our children of color is quite a different thing of itself, but that's for another day. I would like to now turn some time over to Marlene, and then we'll get on the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Chin. I call him Gus. Gus and I were law school, well, we attended law school at the same time. We graduated the same year. And so I think we can say we shared similar experiences in law school. First of all, I want to thank the Dean for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel. It's a very interesting book to read. I learned a lot of things that I as an immigration lawyer didn't even know before. Also, I would like to point out, I'd like to invite everybody to watch the PBS documentary that came out this month on Asian Americans. So you just go to pbs.org and you'll find the link. It goes very well with the book. So I watched the series, the documentary series, and read the book at the same time, and it all makes sense. You know, everything is in context. So, you know, a lot of the things that the author, Angelo Ancheta, talks about is identity as an Asian American. So I'd like to first talk about my identity, my background. I was born in the Philippines, so I'm Filipino. I came to the United States when I was 12 years old, so I'm an immigrant. I became a citizen when I was 18. And, you know, I can relate to the author in that he's also Filipino, and he's about my age. And I think that the difference is I'm a first generation immigrant. I immigrated, and I have that experience. I have this experience as an immigrant. So when I came to the United States from the Philippines, this was during the time of martial law under the dictatorship of Marcos. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a colonel in the Philippine Army. So he was with Marcos. My mother wanted to come for the economic opportunities. And she benefited from the Immigration Act of 1965, which opened up immigration for different countries and for the employment and families. So she was able to come under the employment-based visa as a nurse, and she brought us, her family. And I arrived here in 1973. So martial law in the Philippines, and a year later, after I arrived, President Nixon was getting impeached. And so I was really impressed with the United States Constitution. Wow, we have a great form of government with a constitution that allows for checks and balances. So I have a great appreciation of the laws of the United States and the Constitution. when I was in high school, so I started junior high school here. I went to high school. When I was in high school, I went to Fairfax High, which at that time was considered one of the most multicultural schools in Los Angeles. Okay, this is LA. And I was happy that, you know, I had friends. I had a very diverse group of friends, and we really, we appreciated each other's cultures, backgrounds. It was also a Jewish area, so a lot of Jewish friends, Black friends, Asian friends, so Latin American friends. And then I started college at Cal State LA. And being the social person that I am, I thought, hey, you know, the social life is in the sororities, you know. So I tried to join a sorority with my German American friend, classmate, and we, you know, tried to get recruited during Pledge Week. And after a while, I realized, wait, we've done so many activities, like they're not admitting me. And then I realized, forget it, you know, I'm not going to bother with this. So then I got involved with the Filipino Association. So, you know, I was thinking it really doesn't matter, race doesn't matter, or at least, you know, coming from a diverse background, I thought, you know, so it was an eye-opener for me. It's the first time I saw that I was being seen as different. And then I began to focus mainly on the Filipino experience. And then when I was, I think I went to college at Cal State LA, I started having I had my first child when I was a junior. And so I took a break and I thought, you know, I'll continue later on. And what happened was I was listening to the board nomination hearings during, you know, as I was staying at home nursing my child, and I thought, wait, now who are these people trying to make a decision? And I thought, well, oh, they are senators. And what are their backgrounds? Aha, they went to law school. Ah, I want my voice heard. I want to be at the table when people are making decisions for me. And so I decided to go to law school. So now I've been an immigration attorney for 20 years. And I'm a member of, I serve as the secretary for American Immigration Lawyers Association, and also the general counsel for the Asian American Association of Utah, which is also the Refugee Immigration Center. So I just want to focus on chapter 4, because chapter 4 is titled Race, Immigration, and Citizenship. So the point that he makes is that racially discriminatory laws continue to play a role in upholding immigration and anti-immigration laws. It's really hard, you know, for us immigration attorneys to fight when all the president or Congress have to do is with Congress is cite its plenary power over immigration law. And for the president, it's the national security interest, so that you know, and this plenary power was based on these Chinese exclusion cases. And today's travel ban or Muslim ban is just like Korematsu. The president can say national security, and there goes, who cares about civil rights? That's all trumped. Oh, sorry. Pardon the pun. Anyway, well, that's all I have to share. I now turn the time over to Orion Shin. Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you, S.J. Quinney and Dean Warner for inviting me to join this panel. I have to agree with everything that's been said so far. This book has, what was great about this book is that it consolidates all of the case law, all of the history that APIs have experienced within America into one book. I think what's different when you're going to law school and taking con law or immigration law is that these cases are kind of interspersed and kind of everywhere, but not, this book really helps to bring it all together and kind of, and really not kind of, but it ensures that people can understand a little bit better the experience of the Asian American Pacific Islander communities. So this book was great. I used Kindle, so I don't know the actual page numbers. I tried following and it didn't match up. But I wanted to just start with just saying how much I enjoyed reading this book, especially during APOM and during this time when, as Dean Warner had mentioned, COVID-19 has really brought back probably the uglier side of our society, where discrimination does happen and people do fall back to their biases. At the same time, I do want to say that we have made great strides. APIs are at the table at a lot of policy level discussions around immigration, civil rights, and 20, 30 years ago, that was tougher, especially when we're talking, for example, the deferred action for the Dreamers. A lot of the conversation, majority of the conversation, as it should be, has been focused on the Latino population. But what that does is it obscures the fact that DACA also impacts undocumented Black community as well as APIs. And so this book was really great to read through, especially since it was published in 2008, to see what's happened since then in the last 12 years. A lot's happened, and I'm really looking forward to, I'm kind of curious if he's doing a third edition of this book, because I think the last 5 years or so would really change some of this book or add more context to the book. So I would like to just start and talk a little bit more about how this book really does talk about policy, the law, and how policy now is being impacted because of these laws and because of our preconceived notions or discriminations or education. I think it was really interesting in the first couple of chapters when he really did talk about the foreigner narrative, the non-white narrative, and the model minority narrative. Like Dean Warner was saying, just how API communities have been used and have been characterized in order to benefit and in order to subordinate these cultures. And so what really impacted me about this is that the model minority, the foreigner, all of these paradigms and narratives, and not being Black or white, being in that limbo, they all result in policy today being created not for APIs or not even representing APIs, which is a very big issue, especially when, as you can tell, majority of our community, the API community, is immigrants. Even on this panel, my parents immigrated here. We have, and Judge Chin and Marlene both immigrated here. Like it's a serious issue where I think in the past, APIs were either just discriminated against or, there are too many Asians in, I think is one of the things that the book had said. There are too many Asians, so let's try and create some policy around that. Or just not including the API voice in important conversations around common sense immigration reform when it comes to the different quotas that there are placed on different Asian countries, or for example, the Dreamer or the travel ban issue. I think now we are becoming a lot more aware, and API groups have been diligent, and as I'm sure we can all attest to, just very adamant about being part of the conversation right now, because maybe 30 years ago, that was not the case. One thing that I really just enjoyed was that model minority conversation that he had about, we're brought up, we're kind of put on a pedestal, APIs, saying that, oh, look, this individual is doing really well, so there is no racism here. But if you dig a little, if you just kind of skim the surface and look a little bit deeper, that's not the case. Even in our profession as attorneys, where APIs represent 10%, which is represent in the tier 1 law schools about 10% of the minority population of students of color, when you look at what that results in their professional career, it really doesn't, it becomes apparent that there are certain barriers that we can't see yet, preventing attorneys, Asian American attorneys, to advance even further. One thing I wanted to point out is in 2017, California Supreme Court Justice Liu, along with some Yale Law School students, published a report called the Portrait Project. And this report is about API students, law students and attorneys. This was released when I was still policy counsel at NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. And they showed that even when APIs represented 10% of enrollment in Tier 1 law schools, they only represent 6.5% of federal law clerkships or 4.6% of state law clerkships. Whereas in comparison, when we look at the Caucasian population, they represent about 58% of the law students in the Tier 1 schools, but they represent over 80% of the federal and state law clerkships. So there is a difference, and the Latino student population, the Black population are also impacted, especially when we're talking about clerkships, as Asians. And so there's some things that we still need to figure out, I think, as a community, as attorneys, to figure out why this is happening. And also the bamboo ceiling's still there. Even if we do represent, even if APIs represent a lot of attorneys in big law firms or counsels at companies, one thing that you may have been apparent is that advancement is still a problem. Like, there are a lot of associates, and there are a lot, and this is what the Portrait Project showed in 2017, is that while they're able to get their foot in the door, the question of whether they can advance is another question, and whether they can become that shareholder or partner. There are other statistics that are very fascinating. I know that 2.0 of this report is coming out soon, and I will definitely share it with everybody, but to give a little bit more context to what's happening for API as attorneys, I thought I would bring that up. I mean, I just want to just piggyback off of what Marlene has been talking about immigration. There is really no way to talk about the Asian American experience without talking about immigration. And this book really did a good job of kind of highlighting how that's impacted our experience as Americans or as residents of the United States. And I think it's important to, I mean, one thing that I just kept thinking about is how has it become that, excuse me. So one of the things I thought about a lot was this section where, and I can't give page numbers, I'm sorry, but in chapter 4, the author talks about the difference between law of immigration and the laws of immigrants, and how a lot of times that courts and Congress have kind of convoluted the two, where immigration is, allowing people in, whereas the laws for immigrants, people who are here already, have been confused and muddled over the years from our history, which has continued to impact our experience as APIs here. There's so much packed in here, from affirmative action, plenary doctrine, the intersectionality, the different discrimination lawsuits that came out. There's so much, Korematsu. It's a great introduction for anybody who wants to learn more about this aspect of our country. And thank you for letting me join this and giving me the opportunity to read this with you guys.
Great, thank you so much. Those were fantastic presentations. I've just learned even more listening to you all. Thank you so much for being willing to share your personal experiences too. I know that those are really impactful, and appreciate your willingness to be so honest with us today. So now we have approximately 20 minutes for questions. Again, if you have a question for the panelists, please put it into the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screens. And our first question comes from Victoria Vincent. Victoria, thank you so much for attending. I know that this is your third one that you've come in a row, so we really appreciate that you are a regular attendee and question asker. So Victoria asked, in the news media, we have seen awful acts of racial prejudice against African American and Latino populations, and especially this past week has been particularly brutal and difficult. That's just my editorializing. Why do we not see more grievances against Asian American populations shown in the media? How do we become better aware of what Asian Americans might be facing? Any thoughts?
I'll take the first stab if Judge Chin and Marlene don't mind, but I think for me, it kind of goes back to that. What first popped in my head was it goes back to that idea of model minority and how society already doesn't really pay attention to the API grievances because, oh, they're already doing well, it's okay. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is just a lack of awareness. And also, and this is just anecdotal personally, I think that a lot of API communities, maybe it's because they're more undocumented or they're more of an immigrant population, they're more afraid to bring these grievances up, raise them, thinking that it might impact their future here. How do we better become aware of, there are a lot of great API organizations. I mean, the Asian American, community, the Utah Marlene's group, excuse me, I'm sure is a great, I'm sorry, I don't know the organization, but I'm sure it's a great place to start.
Yes, it's the Asian Association of Utah, and we have a yearly festival to let people know about the culture, the different cultures. But I think my take on that is why not so much focus on Asian American discrimination? Maybe because the mainstream also agrees that, oh yeah, well, maybe they're thinking, oh, I understand, maybe they deserve it, with this coronavirus discrimination against Asian people, not just the Chinese, same thing, right? So I think it's similar to that.
I think in part it's because there's a degree of fear of retribution if they were to voice their experiences. And so for a lot of those of the Asian community, they'd rather suffer through it and hopefully it improves rather than bring attention to it and create more of an environment of hostility because that's their great fear. I think how do we become better aware is by virtue of when you see something in terms of conduct or someone expressing, then you get the realization that it's still there, that even though there's this model minority concept, that experience still exists today. And I think one of the things that is clear is that we'll never be rid of it. It will always be there. It's just whether or not someone's really willing to bring it to the attention of the main population.
And that actually leads me nicely, while we're waiting for more questions to come in from the audience. One of my thoughts is, what can people who are not members of the API, Asian American, Pacific Islander community, what can we do to help bring awareness to these issues? Is there anything we can do to help address these issues, to help educate, to be better allies? What could we do in these circumstances, especially knowing, as the book points out, we see spikes in discrimination against Asian American and Asian and Pacific Islander communities during times of economic recession. So we have to, just based on history, believe that this spike in discrimination is going to continue, at least for probably the next year. So what can we do as allies and people who want to help?
So that the documentary that I recommended, like I told everybody in my firm, I'm the only Asian female attorney. I'm the only minority female attorney. We do have females and we have predominantly males, but I feel very included. So I appreciate my firm for that. But one of the things that I thought was, well, I should share with everybody what I'm learning about Asian Americans, my experiences, because it's not like they don't want to know about it. But if I didn't say anything, I think we should be open about sharing when we hear something and just to let people know and to educate everybody. And then you know, we can get along better and love each other more because we can appreciate our diversity.
I think in response, one of the things I noted in the conclusion, the author suggests what is needed is not a homogeneous, colorblind system of racial values, but a set of core values that recognizes and appreciates differences, both racial and non-racial. So we can do our part by making sure that we're not displaying that kind of bias, or where we observe it, we call it out immediately and help the person to really identify how inappropriate that may be. Because where the author talks about the conscious and the unconscious develops from somewhere. So some experience has created that unconscious value. And it's not true that you can't change, but it will be a challenge to change that mindset. And if we can play our part in correcting that mindset, then it will and can make a difference. It's a long road. We're not even halfway there yet. If you look back at what Dr. King said, we haven't even reached the point where people can be viewed on the content of their character compared to the color of their skin. We still view it that way. You go into a store, if someone goes in a store and they're of minority descent and someone goes in of the majority population, the minority will always be viewed with some sort of suspicion as well. And we have to change that. Stores have to change that. My children have experienced it as well. So unless that changes, we're still going to just cycle through.
I think one way we can really start working on it, and just to echo everybody else, I guess, is being aware of what's going on and, you know, being open to learning about it. I think when it comes to API issues and discrimination, a lot of people may think we're overreacting or just turn a blind eye to it because, you know, there's this conception that APIs, if you look at, for example, salary or something, that is a statistic that comes up often, is pay, that we're doing relatively well. I mean, some ethnicities are, but there are other Pacific Islander, and this is where desegregation comes into mind, which is another topic that he talks about. But to understand API issues is to understand that it's not homogenous and that there are a lot of different issues impacting different people. I think one of the ways is really to educate. I think I heard the docuseries was great. Haven't had a chance to watch it yet. There's great books out there from Helen Zia or Erica Lee that you can read to continue your education. Calling it out is going to be critical, especially during this pandemic. And as we know that there has been a rise of hate crimes against APIs, and then there are a lot of API groups that I didn't even know existed until moving to DC and just like learning more about the API community, that there are a lot of organizations like NAPABA, which is the APA Bar Association. There's a whole coalition of bars of color, excuse me, and so it's also creating those allies, because one of the last things that really he leaves the book on is creating those allyships is critical. To advance Asian American issues is to advance African American and Black issues, is to advance Latino issues. It's not just APIs need to advance, only APIs have to advance. It's not going to work. It's more of ensuring that all of the minorities come together and can create those allyships with the white community, Caucasian community, to ensure that this can move forward, because we know that the API voice, it can be quieter or not as strong, and everybody just needs to work together. I mean, it sounds like a Sesame Street song, but it's true. Everybody needs to work together to make this happen. It can't happen in a silo.
Thank you so much for that. I think those are really concrete ways that we who want to ally can help. And I appreciate the direction and the recommendations. So Dennis Gladwell asked, I would be interested in your view of the Harvard litigation, i.e. reducing the enrollment of Asians in order to boost African-American school population. Any thoughts on that pending litigation?
Well, I'm not, sure about the details of the litigation right now, but the book, he talks about that affirmative action and having too many Asians as if they were taking the place of the white candidates. And so I think he addresses it in the book very well. And, I don't know what page it's in, but Gus, you remember what he said about that?
I don't. However, I tend to think, though, that when we view all things equally, in terms of the whole notion of diversity, there's this misconception that APIs are taking spots that should go to someone more deserving. Well, if you're equally deserving of the opportunity, that's what everyone's seeking, to be treated equally with that same opportunity to make those inroads and advancements. I don't know much about the litigation, and I have to be cautious as how I respond by virtue of my position. But I just think that by virtue of where things are, we will never get to a point where there's equality in all aspects.
So I worked on this a little bit, very slightly at NAPABA. It was more, somebody else in my organization really took the helm on this one. But even within NAPABA, it's a tough conversation to have, and it's a tough issue, and there isn't a clear answer. I mean, I guess it's a lot with the law, is just also needing to understand where this is coming from. So for me, I think that this litigation is personally is the wrong path to take. I don't, and the underlying issue is the premise that Judge Chin mentioned was, are Asian Americans taking seats away from other students of color? And that isn't, and I think that paradigm and that conversation and that issue is the incorrect one. And I don't think that, from what I remember from the Harvard litigation, I don't think that's how we should be going about it. Affirmative action has helped students of color advance. That is a fact. And to try and dismantle affirmative action because of perceived thoughts and assumptions, I think is the incorrect one to have.
Great, thank you. Okay, our next question comes from Vanita Ross. Is there a forum where all immigrant groups can leverage their experiences as immigrants to share and build?
Okay.
You're both muted.
Sorry, I am looking for the website that you're asking for. There is actually a couple of organizations that are trying to collect these stories. One group is collecting stories very specifically to immigration, especially as these issues continue to create tension within the different immigrant communities. And I will send it to the law school, and hopefully we can distribute it that way. I think that might be the best.
Yeah, and we have a list of attendees, so we should be able to get that out to the attendees. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question. So Holly Langton asks, What do you think about educational opportunities like the Project Implicit, a nonprofit organization and international collaboration between researchers who are interested in implicit social cognition, thoughts and feelings outside of conscious awareness and control? The goal of the organization is to educate the public about hidden biases and to promote a virtual laboratory for collecting data on the internet. Should this type of education be more available?
Yes.
Yes, I would say definitely. It's really education, and it's exposing ourselves and sharing our experiences with other people, that we can learn that we are all the same. We are human beings with this experience on earth, experiencing human life, and we should not let these superficial differences get in our way, or we should have these we should not treat them as negatives, but as positives. Anyway, yes, education is always a key.
And from a policies perspective, the more data you have, the easier it is to get legislation and law passed in the way that we want. That's one of the biggest questions that anybody will ask of you when you're trying to ask for like a specific language or something, is where's the data behind your suggestion? And for a lot of API issues, the data is limited or non-existent. And so this would be fantastic.
I agree. There is an emphasis right now on implicit bias for all members of the bench and even within the legal profession. And it clearly indicates that there is still that need to identify those discriminatory issues that we may each have. And I think one thing that the author mentions that I noted also, no matter how a non-white child is raised, the child will still encounter racial prejudice and discrimination growing up. It's a given as well. So that sort of education is quite important and quite relevant. Even at this age, in this century, you would think there'll be less of a need, but I think there's even a greater need, even by virtue of what's being currently experienced by people of Asian descent because of our COVID-19 situation.
Great, and I think that's a really nice way to end today's panel, kind of this call to action to be aware of the fact that racism and discrimination still exists, is still impacting the Asian American, Asian and Pacific Islander population here in the United States. I think we've gotten some really great feedback from our panelists on ways that those of us who are interested in being allies and can help can do it, and also in some ways that maybe members of the community can come together to share experiences and share data in a way that will help us address these issues moving forward. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. This has just been an exceptional conversation, and I think a great way to end May and celebration of Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you. And we'll be back at the end of June for another of these discussions. June is LGBTQ+ awareness and celebration. It's Pride Month. And so we will be reading a book along those lines. And we look forward to discussing issues affecting the LGBTQ+ community at the end of June. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you,
Thank
Dean.
you, Dean.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.